In tonight's episode, I'm going to be telling you some terrifying accounts of hiking and camping stories in the deep woods. These are submitted to me by viewers just like you. Our first story is shared with us by a gentleman who goes by the name Zach. And while they have shared this story with other channels, they'd like a chance for me to read it as well because it kind of helps him cope with the experience. Around July of 2011, Zach was 21 years old, and Zach's aunt and uncle from his dad's side of the family in the Midwest came out to visit the family that lives in the Pacific Northwest. One of the highlights of their trip specifically was that his uncle, who was his dad's sister's husband, and not related to him by blood, though he was still a pretty cool guy, wanted to experience deep-sea halibut fishing on the Oregon coast, which Zach's father had arranged via a charter. And lucky enough for Zach, he had the privilege of being able to go on this fishing trip with his uncle and his father. Zach wanted to take a second and include a little bit of information about himself before continuing, as despite the use of his wheelchair, he's always loved activities like fishing and hiking and traveling and camping, and for staying still is just not an option for him. However, the day right before they're due to set out, the charter was canceled due to bad weather, a common disappointment that many deep-sea fishermen face. While Zach and his party are all disappointed by this unfortunate setback, to put it lightly, Zach's father, uncle, and him were determined to do at least a little bit of fishing and then decided on a place called Devil's Lake, located near where Zach and them were staying on the Oregon coast. Anyway, the day after the charter was canceled, Zach, his father, and his uncle load up into his uncle's truck and they left early in the dawn to go do their fishing. So when they get to the lake, it was like something out of a fisherman's dream. Calm and pristine with not another soul in sight for miles. There was a rather precarious fishing dock, one that seemed to float on the water and had no guardrails or anything of that nature. And they decided to set up shop there, so to speak. Zach went ahead and baited his pole, casting his line into the water. Zach's dad and uncle went back to the truck for their chairs and the cooler, so that way they could have something to relax and to enjoy whatever snacks and drinks they had decided to bring along with them. All the fishing gear was already out on the dock, so Zach and party didn't have to worry about anything. Now, Zach didn't think anything about being left alone on the dock as his uncle and father went back to the car because all he had to do was simply look behind him, and there they would be. Nothing too out of the norm. Frankly, Zach's attention was drawn to the sky of all things. Birds of prey were always a fascination with him, and he looks above him to see if there were any in the skies. Zach always admired how the hawks and ospreys seemed to be expert fishermen on the many fishing excursions Zach has been on when he would be lucky to even get a bite. Bald eagles had been said to be in Oregon, though they were rare and yet places like lakes around the Oregon coast where you would find them, so Zach thought maybe he'd see one that day. So focused on Zach, on his thoughts, that what happened next didn't register until he was on the ground. Something had jerked Zach forward so hard that his wheelchair not only did a 180-degree turn, but spilled him out onto the dock as well. A strong, big fish wasn't possible because if that was the case, he would have been pulled straight in from the front of his wheelchair into the water. Instead, it felt as if something had grabbed hold of his right wheel and wrenched so hard that instead of falling straight into the water, Zach instead did a 180 turn and spilled out of the wheelchair onto his stomach. This thought that flashed through Zach's mind was further cemented when his wheelchair was pulled away from him and he heard it splash into the water. Thankfully, he can't mean this sincerely enough. He had always made it a habit to cut the seatbelts off of his chairs whenever he got them. Otherwise, this encounter of his would have probably ended up much differently. Yet, no sooner than when he had heard his wheelchair go into the lake, he can feel a pressure close around one of his legs before he was pulled backwards as he made a desperate attempt to crawl away, giving an involuntary shout as he was yanked back. And there was nothing to grasp on the dock to anchor himself, and so in sheer panic, he rolls himself onto his back, not thinking of what he'd encounter, and that's when he finally saw it. That face. That face was the only thing he could look at. It was so human in its oval feminine appearance, with sharp, tooth-like scales running vertically down the entire area of her flesh, like some sort of natural armor that were a molted greenish blue-gray color that matched the water. and atop her head were these gently writhing long fleshy strands of muscle that to Zach looked like seaweed that cascaded behind her back. There was a nose with normal nostrils like a human being, but with small gill-like slits fluttering on the sides of where her nose was. Then there were those eyes. These amber golden eyes with these soft rectangular black pupil that if he were to compare now with another animal, it would be an octopus. They were so full of rage and anger, yet an also unmistakable intelligence. And part of the way Zach has tried to cope with this encounter is by actually trying to humanize his attacker, despite her being far from it at all, which is why he refers to it as a her. It seems as soon as his eyes locked with its, it triggered an enraged response, as she, or it, left its body on top of Zach's. Zach could not guess why she didn't just try and pull him into the water to finish Zach off. Maybe she thought it'd be easier to kill him on land before she dragged him into the lake's depths. He remembers as the being was on top of him, feeling this sharp, stinging sensation envelop on his back, which, although excruciatingly painful, was nothing compared to the terror that was trying to rip his face off as this thing, this creature, bared its human-like teeth despite the obvious serrations on the ends of them. With the way he's describing the teeth in this account, I envision something like this. Instinctively, Zach had brought his arms and hands into a defensive position before managing to get his forearm underneath the creature's throat while his other hand pressed against her forehead, which then caused the being to utter a frustrated, somewhat strangled hiss. Zach too knows that in the moment, he was frantically screaming at the top of his lungs and crying. There was no time to think, just act in that situation. And that's what he did until his uncle came and struck the being in the face and head with his boot repeatedly. Almost simultaneously, Zach's father struck the being in the back of the head with a fishing club, the weapon breaking on the fifth strike over her skull. It was here in this moment that this being's grip loosened and Zach was pulled away, while at the same time hearing something heavy sliding back into the water at what Zach assumed was the being retreating. From there, Zach was carried back into his uncle's truck with his father and uncle barking orders at each other in chaos. Zach was sat upright in the back of his uncle's truck because apparently he had severe lacerations all over his back, and the father sat beside Zach the entire ride while they drove to the nearest hospital, whilst simultaneously calling for an ambulance. The attack couldn't have lasted longer than a minute in total from the time the being grabbed his chair and tried to pull him to the lake to his dad and uncle fighting it off. While everybody was at the hospital, they had no idea what to make of it. I mean, they couldn't tell the doctors they saw a lake monster, so they simply tried to blame the nature of the wounds on a mountain lion, which Zach went along with because none of them had the energy to try and explain what they saw, nor would anybody even believe them. There were lacerations on his arms, his back, even his leg, where the being had grabbed hold that satisfied the doctors enough with their response. Eventually, when Zach brought the subject up with his uncle and father, they told him the same thing. They had heard Zach screaming and saw this large being pressed on top of him. When they rushed in, they got a very good look at it, and both of them described the same thing. It was about the size of an average man at 6 feet, and those same sharp, toothy-looking scales adorned its entire body along that same molted blue-green grayish color. Its strong arms were wrapped behind his back as it tried to take a bite out of Zach's head. From the back of its neck to the base of its spine, there was apparently a single uniform row of sturdy, sharp-looking spines, almost like a crocodile, but more defined. They said that Zach's attacker had strong-looking legs as well that ended in large taloned feet that were planted on either side of Zach as the creature tried to finish him off. Yet, the freakiest element to the being, according to Zach's uncle and father, was the being's giant tail that was almost the length of her entire body, and they said it looked like a stereotypical mermaid tail, except with the sharp-looking scales and single uniform rows of spines on either side and on top of the tail. Furthermore, when Zach's father recalled hitting the beast, he noted that no matter how hard he hit it, there was no blood or bruising as if the animal's hide were a natural armor, which Zach wouldn't argue. A decade has now passed since the incident, and Zach doesn't think he's worse for wear. He's had plenty of time to cope with what happened, mostly by researching what happened to try and just make sense of everything. Interestingly enough, Zach has found in his research that there are multiple reports of a lake monster in Devil's Lake, but the description of said beast is that of an octopus and not a mermaid-type being. In fact, the only reference to mermaids in the Pacific Northwest that Zach found is of an Inuit legend known as the Kalupalik, which is a dangerous sea being that resembles a woman and preys on humans. Zach has always tried to look at things with a scientific mind, and he's done the same thing with this being that he encountered. Zach wonders if perhaps she is a different branch of evolution from humans, forced to be as brutal as the ocean environment she lives in order to survive. So what do you guys think? With all the strange phenomena about lakes and oceans, and if you guys have ever gotten to check out the Politis work where he talks about why and the legends that go into areas getting the name devil in them, and it truly makes you wonder what exactly lurks beneath. This next story submitted to me, what I refer to as almost taken, details a terrifying experience in the Pine Barrens. Our eyewitness, who will remain nameless, from 2010 through 2015 was living out of a van and would travel all over the country like a vagabond, staying in Walmart parking lots, friends' driveways, campsites, and oftentimes just down some paths into the woods that was wide enough to fit his vehicle. He had had countless wild adventure stories from that 5-year period, but decided to share this one with me personally. During this time, and specifically for the last 2 years of his homelessness adventures, he had stuck to the east coast of the United States, slowly making his way more and more north to New Hampshire and Maine in the warmer months, and then heading slowly south as the winter time approached to avoid the blistering cold of the northern states of the eastern U.S. He had made friends with contacts from Florida to Maine and would stop for a week or two at certain locations to work, make some travel money, and visit with people he knew along the way. One of the ways he made money then was buying and selling antique guns, so he would do his best to avoid certain states that were not exactly gun-friendly, like Massachusetts and Maryland and New Jersey, as he would usually have a gun or two with him and was always under the threat of being harassed by local and state police due to this specific lifestyle. The previous year, while heading north, he had decided to save time by breaking his travel rule by passing through New Jersey. He had made friends while camping with some backwoods New Jersey people known as Pineys. They call themselves that because they live in a little known but fairly vast forest in the southern half of the state, known more commonly as the Pine Barrens. These good folks took an instant liking to him and had spent almost a week living at his campsite with him. They worked as roofers during the day and drank booze and raised hell at night. They were super friendly, fiercely loyal, and very hardworking. So, in 2015, as he was headed south for Central Florida, he made sure to swing by New Jersey again, just so he can hang out with the Pineys and make a little cash roofing with them. So he spent about a good 6 to 12-hour days roofing with his friends and stayed in his van parked at his friend's small farm in the Pine Barrens. On the 7th day, after he decided that after hearing endless tales about the wonders of the Pine Barrens from his piney friends, all that week he needed to take the time to explore the woods of the southern New Jersey just for a bit before heading south for the winter. He went online and found a specific campsite that allowed for vehicle camping and was perfectly situated on the Mullica River. It had miles and miles of hiking trails for him to explore. He kept a rather expensive folding mountain bike in his van and was always looking for a chance or an excuse to take it out and explore. But due to the very flat land, the Pine Barrens seemed like the perfect spot for that. So he sets up camp and was beyond thrilled on the first night to be able to have a fire and enjoy the cool night air while losing himself in the dance of the flickering flames. He spent the next few days just biking around the wilderness, fishing the river, and howling back and forth with the local coyotes at night. Now, on the 4th night, things began to get weird. The coyotes that had kept him company the previous night were nowhere to be found, and he kept hearing a loud whistling every so often in the woods around his campsite. And just like a human whistle, but louder. Around midnight, he could hear someone slowly circling as he sat at his fire. It sounded like a human, but on 2 feet trying to be quiet as it moved through the dead and dry leaves just out of sight. This is when he began feeling uneasy, and even though it was not allowed in New Jersey, he grabbed his snub-nose, a .357 Magnum, out of the van and kept it in his jacket pocket. When most people think of New Jersey, they think of a densely populated cityscape or Jersey Shore beaches. But make no mistake, Southern New Jersey can be as backwoods and deliverance feeling as parts of West Virginia. Although it was a little risky, he decided that it would be best to keep his .357 on him for the rest of the time being there, just for safety. The next day, he spent exploring the area on foot and hiked for miles, coming across what looked like a primitive campsite. It had 2 small shelters made from branches and twisted saplings, all weaved together. Inside one of the shelters was a few items of old torn clothing, an old non-functioning boombox, and a few chrome pieces of a car. The shelters were in no way weatherproof, as there was no way to keep the rain out of them, so he was left very confused as to why somebody would go to such elaborate lengths to build them. On the edge of the campsite clearing were multiple trees that had fallen over away from the campsite. About 4 medium-sized pine trees fallen in opposite directions from each other, roots sticking out of the sandy soil. That afternoon, after a long day of exploration, he makes his way back to where his van was. He has a big meal, enjoys his dinner, and went to sit on a bed of perfect moss along the edge of the Mullica River, just to go ahead and relax and watch the sunset. Now he's sitting there enjoying himself, and the sun was about to dip down behind the trees, and he's just enjoying himself with his headphones on, listening, relaxing to music. And that's when things begin to happen. And he's just waiting for the evening to slowly creep in. He was feeling so alive, and just then, a barnyard-type smell fills the air around him. And he could feel the hair on the back of his neck begin to stand straight up as a chill runs down his spine. This is strange. He begins to pivot to his right to look behind him, and just then, and the last thing he remembers was BAM! Something smashing into the right side of his head and face, tremendous pain, and a loud ringing. He goes out and is awakened again by the stinging of a sharp tree branch scratching across the left side of his face. He opens his eyes and sees the ground beneath him moving, and his chin bouncing up off the solid hide with coarse hair as the earth moved below him. Confused, and the pain in his head was almost unbearable, he fights to stay conscious. These few seconds were very confusing. He opens his eyes again and starts to look around and sees 2 hairy legs below him, moving in stride. Then he felt another almost unbearable pain as his ankles were compressed together and grinded against each other, while whatever was carrying him adjusted its grip around them, crushing them together with one hand. He realizes all of a sudden that someone was carrying him over their hairy shoulder and moving quickly through the woods. He's in a state of complete shock and also in agonizing pain from his head to his feet, but a huge surge of adrenaline shoots through his body, and all of a sudden he's wide awake. Now he's too afraid to start kicking and screaming and draw attention to himself, so he goes into a mental panic and begins searching frantically for any options in his head. He then remembers that his .357 was in the small of his back, in a leather holster with a snap button closure. His right arm was blocked by the creature, so he reaches behind himself with his left hand and quickly unsnaps the holster strap and struggles to free the gun as it was set up to be drawn by the right hand. Nevertheless, he manages to get it free, brought it in front of himself, thumb cocking the hammer, putting the barrel right to the hairy back directly below him, squeezes pulling the trigger. BAM! The gun goes off, sending a 158 grain lead nose bullet into the right side of his attacker's back at point blank range. Whatever was holding him, the creature, the thing, the being, the person, lets out a bellowing scream, dropping him right on top of his head. He rolls onto his right side, finally getting a good look at what had been carrying him. Make no mistake, his claim is that this was a Bigfoot. There was no doubt at what he was looking at. He knew what it was the second he saw it and has never been so terrified in his life. It was facing his direction while reaching its right hand behind itself, clawing at the hole it had just put in its back, while staring at him in disbelief. He still had the gun in his left hand, took aim at the monster again, and he says that when he pointed it, its expression changed from pain and disbelief to pure fear. It knew what a gun was. He shot it again, somewhere center mass as it was turning to run, and it yelped much like a dog does when it gets hurt, and tore off into the brush at incredible speed. He could hear it crashing through the brush and the trees like a freight train as it ran off into the distance. He stayed there on his side for a few seconds with his left hand still pointing the gun and shaking it wildly. He then thought to himself, what if it comes back? What if it's not alone? He was instantly overwhelmed with fear, jumping to his feet and sprinting as fast as he could in the opposite direction as this thing had gone. He ran for only a few hundred yards before he knew where he was. It would seem that this thing had only gone a short distance before he had woken. He runs to his campsite and begins frantically throwing everything haphazardly into his van. I mean, he was sure that this thing was going to come back for revenge at any moment. He checks the cylinder of his 5-shot revolver, quickly replacing the 2 spent shells with fresh rounds. Then he stomps on the gas and rips the hell out of there. Now, after a few minutes of driving on dirt roads, he finally comes out to pavement and his fear begins finally subsiding. But at that same time, the pain in his head and face spiked to a horrible level so that he was forced to head to the hospital. When he gets to the ER, he had not even considered what he was going to tell them had happened. He looked like he had been hit by a Mack truck and felt like it too. He decided to tell them that he was attacked by somebody in the woods who had hit him. This was a bad idea as they had a police officer there within a few moments to take a report, and he claims that the officer could tell he was not telling the truth and kept pressing for what really happened. He stuck to the story and eventually left. Turns out he had suffered a terrible concussion as well as a torn eardrum in his right ear. The next day, his face had swelled so badly that his right eye was swollen shut, and his jaw had hurt so badly he could barely chew solid food for almost a week. He speculates that Bigfoot had smacked him upside the head with an open hand, but he can't be too sure. Needless to say, he had never and will never go camping back in the Pine Barrens after this experience. He calls his friends from that area, told them what had happened, and they confirmed that every so often someone will encounter a Bigfoot-like creature in the woods around where they live. While this isn't the most violent Bigfoot story that I've ever read or encountered, it is certainly terrifying to be while you're being captured. In fact, this story is very similar to the Ostman story, which I covered on my channel not too long ago. Very similar story of a man being captured by a family of Bigfoot, and anyway, you can check that out. I think the scariest thing about this particular story is we have no idea what this creature had in store for him. Was it going to eat him? Was it going to kill him? Or worse, we don't know. I'll let you guys be the judge of this one. I'd love to know what you guys think of today's stories. Did they blow your mind, or are they simply made up creepypasta? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to smack that like button. If you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and pound that subscribe button and keep your notifications turned on so YouTube will hopefully keep you up to date on every time I release a brand new video. As always, guys, I love you all. Thanks for watching. Keep an open mind, but take every story with a grain of salt, as entertaining as they are, and I'll see you guys all in the very next video.